Welcome back to a podcast about self-help using memes. I'm your host, Blake Moore. This episode is how we deal with the second half of the question, how do I know if I'm right? Or how do I make good choices? And the emphasis on those clearly, since the words are in quotes, is good and right. We covered knowing and epistemology in a different episode. That's what you get at in the first half, the knowing part. How do I know if I'm right? This episode is about all the subjective stuff that comes after that. Let's get into it together. Hey, thanks for tuning in one more time. So before we get into the actual content of the episode, I do want to take a minute and sort of follow through on a promise that I made last episode. There for a while, when I record episodes, since the podcast is called a podcast about self-help using memes, if I'm not going to talk about memes in the internet sense in the episode, I'm going to give you an example of what I mean, because I still have to assume there are some new listeners or people who have skipped directly to this point. I mean meme in a social science concept. And so when you think about it that way, every big idea is a meme, and every idea about ideas is a meme, and the conversation about ideas about memes is a meme. And so I just want to give examples sort of what I mean by that. And today's meme, not to totally rip off Pee Wee Herman, but there's worse shows to rip off than Pee Wee's Playhouse. But the meme of the day, I think I'd like to be playbooks. Just the very, very concept of playbooks. When you zoom out a little bit and think of it, the playbook that a professional sports team uses to make their choices, or the playbook that a cook uses to get their recipes, or the playbook that a set of corporate lawyers might use during a takeover, are really all just plans that someone makes in advance to execute later. That's really all a playbook is. And so when you can see how cookbooks and hostile takeovers are related, you can start connecting those two things in ways that the people doing them might not have thought of. That's all I mean by memes, right? Playbooks. So with our meme of the day example out of the way, again, shout out Pee Wee Herman, thank you. I'd like to get into the content of the episode. And the very first thing I want to talk about in our episode of how we make good choices or how we know if we're right is the very concept of setting up a mental default. What I'd like to do is pretty simple. Help you set up a default way that you should try to act without needing to think about it. To do that, we need a system. And to make a system, we need to decide what rules it should follow. I've got a few. I'll absolutely make podcasts about them and tell you about them. But for the sake of making sure that we're on the same page, we need to establish a criteria for a mental framework of choices, a default, if you will. How should you act, just like a rule? And honestly, that's really long and involves a lot of things. And so I've chosen to call it a framework, but it begs the question, how do we make that? And how do we decide those things? And so last episode, we talked about how we know. That's epistemology. And based on what we talked about in the epistemology episode, there is no safe place to start that search for a framework outside of ourselves, since that's the only knowledge we can really verify without a shared frame of reference beforehand. Once you know me to be an expert, you can start to trust the things that I say, but until then, you kind of just have to trust what you know. And so here are the guiding principles for how I'd like to set up a mental default. Number one, these are my rules for me, or your rules for you. You can explain them, but you can't make other people follow them. We're going to go through how I think people should act, or how we think people should act if you subscribe to the sort of things I think. But you can't make somebody else. My parents, or specifically my dad, always used to say that kids aren't robots. You can tell them what you think the right way to act is, but you don't have a remote control. You can't push buttons to make someone else act the way you want. And to do that violates a fundamental principle of what I think makes people people, and that's called autonomy. It's basically the idea that you should be able to pick what happens to you. It's the reason that being made a slave against your will is bad. It's just a concept called autonomy. So if I can force my rules on you, that means you can force your rules on me, and I'm not really into that. So everybody should be able to decide these rules for themselves. If you can't make a case to them for why they should follow your ideas, That's on you. That's a problem with the way you phrased it or the metaphor you've used, or maybe your idea is bad. That's also true. But the point I'm getting at here is that these are your rules. So don't get mad when other people don't follow them. They're just your rules. The second kind of guiding principle for how we should set up our framework is that this should try to address subjective stuff. And by that, I mean things like good or right. If possible, we should leave objective things to the measurable and the quantifiable, right? If the question that we're having is, what is the speed, or the question we're trying to answer is like, what is the speed of light? That has a measurable thing. If the question we're trying to answer is, what is good or what is a right choice? That's a little harder because right means different things to different people. Well, we'll kind of get into that. The very third guiding principle is that any framework we come up with needs to be easily understood by everyone, and it needs to be easy enough to do that everyone can be expected to get it right on their own or with minimal guidance, right? And what I'm looking at for here is something easy enough to follow that anybody can try to follow it. And if they're confused or they don't understand how that framework would deal with a choice, they can ask, right? They understand enough to know that they don't know and feel comfortable enough asking. If you'd prefer mental default to mental framework, I don't think that's wrong. But I do think that the concept is the same. And mentally reducing choices honestly very much matters. And you very honestly practice how you play, right? If your stated objective is to do something a certain way, right? Like every time I shoot a free throw, I'm going to do this. And I don't know how to shoot a free throw. I'm not a sports nerd. Sorry. But those of you, I'm a nerd. I'm not calling people who like sports nerds. I'm just saying I'm not that kind of nerd. I don't know the steps of shooting a free throw, but you should have a way that you try to shoot a free throw every time, right? You step up to the line. Your coach has said, okay, now bend your knees, take a deep breath, use both. Right? I don't know how to shoot a free throw, but I'm just saying there are steps to shooting a free throw. I just want to make that happen for your brain. So when you get a new idea, I just want you to have a way that you'd try to do it. You're not going to make every free throw, and then that's fine. But coach told you how to try. So like try, just pretend I'm your mental coach for a little bit. The very last thing I want to talk about in this section before we move on is that you really should spend time orienting your space. That way your mind doesn't have to do as much work. The power of a default choice is its own episode. This is not that show though. And shout out to Alton Brown. Good Eats was really good about saying this is a cool idea, but we will talk about it later when we have time. And right now this isn't that episode. So I will spend a whole podcast talking about why you should spend time making your space yours instead of trying to figure out how you can fit into a different space. But that's a whole different conversation. So we spent a long time talking about how we could or should establish a framework, but I'd kind of like to take you through mine because I think it's pretty cool. My framework is that of a mental coin shaker, and I'll get into what I mean by that. But a coin shaker is kind of my best metaphor, but if you got a better one, make it known, please. That's what the subreddit's for. For this next part, I'd like you to picture a manual coin sorting machine. Typically, this is a small sorting tower, like set of trays. There are, of course, nice electronic versions of this in every grocery store nowadays. Like you just come and dump your jar of coins in. But the version I'm picturing is just a set of plastic trays. It's nothing fancy. If you've never seen one of these before, it's a set of like interlocking trays that are maybe like 4 inches squared. Sorry, I was raised in America. I do inches, not centimeters, but I hope better for us. Anyway, it's a set of trays that are about maybe 4 inches square, 5 inches. I'm sure they could be bigger or smaller, but the point is that it's a set of interlocking trays with different size openings in the bottom of each tray. Different trays just have different sized holes, right? And so you stack them so that when something falls through the bottom of the top tray, it lands in the top of the tray below it, and then it falls through that one and that one and that one. And so the goal is that by the time all the coins hit the bottom of the stack of trays, they're all sorted out and good to go. This concept makes gravity do the work, right? When you get new coins, all you have to do is dump them in the top and shake for a while. I use mental approximations of one of those devices to sort incoming information for me. Imagine that each decision or thought or action or idea that you were working to get right had to come across your mental desk as a coin for your coin sorter. Each idea is a single coin in my version, right? Like if I get a quarter, that could just be some new thing that my neighbor wanted me to try or whatever, right? Every idea is a coin. Each kind of part of our mental framework will be a tray in our stack of trays that we're shaking things through. And so what we want to do is build the trays of our thought sorting machine so new input has to get passed through the filters we put in place. I don't always do this quickly or in real time. Like it can take me a long time to process things. But if I realize I'm doing something that violates one of those rules or ideas or principles, like I've made a tray that says you should act a certain way and I'm not acting that way, I'm honestly more likely to reevaluate why I'm doing that thing versus why I have the tray, right? I've sat down and I've thought about why I would sort of thought that way. In my framework, we find out the answers to questions by putting them at the top of the sorter and then shaking them through the known filters we've got. By creating some really big filters, and I'll give examples of that, we can at least try to find the right path for that item. Imagine you're faced with a new idea or problem, like would anyone really notice if I stole this? Is my wife mad at me? Should I apologize to my brother? Is now a good time to ask for a raise? What does my boss mean by that, right? We can now at least try to resolve those questions by shaking them through our filters or our coin sorters or whatever, right? Sure, some stuff's going to get stuck, just like a button or a paper clip would if you dumped it into an actual coin tray. But no system's fully automatic all the time. So some choices or situations won't be easy to deal with, and that's fine. And so very lastly in this section, I want to talk about memes, right? It's a podcast about memes. How does that relate? So when you view the world as a set of memes, they can help you understand it by making clearer the thought processes behind our choices and actions. They do this for me, so I know it's possible. The goal here is to try, which can only happen if you make an effort. After all, this is a framework to follow for making good choices, not a framework that makes good choices for you. You still have to actually make the choices. So now that we've spent some time talking about what a mental framework is or why we'd use it, let's actually make one, right? What should the first tray of our system of filters or coin sorter or panning for gold? I don't know about you. I watch a lot of How It's Made. And this is a common process in agricultural sorting, right? If you have a product with a bunch of different sizes, I'm thinking specifically like nuts, like walnuts or something like that. Typically, those sort of growers create a system that sorts this kind of stuff out for them. They just roll all the incoming walnuts down that hall, and the little ones drop here, and the big ones drop here, right? That's all we're doing. And so let's make one. What's our first filter? What do we actually put stuff through? And it's pretty easy. It's treat others how you wish they'd treat you. This is not groundbreaking. I didn't invent this. We just kind of call it the golden rule, but it's really simple. Act the way you want other people to act. This is really just the perspective that I look at the golden rule from, and that concept's been in writing and spoken word for a very long time. Pretty simply, just act in the way you'd want others to act. With any given action for yourself, if you were on the other side of it, is that still what you'd want someone else to do? And think of this one as kind of a front desk level staff at a hotel, right? The golden rule, that is. They're there to help most customers most of the time. And then that's what this is in general. Like all else being equal, just act how you'd want someone else to act if they were you and you were them. While I consider this rule to be one of the most important, like any entry into this framework, it's all about knowing when to use it, right? If you put a button or a paper clip through your coin sorter, this one's not going to catch it. And that's fine. It's entirely possible that the answer to would or should someone else act this way in my position is no, but it's still the right choice for you right then. And that's an example of like do as I say, not as I do, right? You can state the way you should do something and still sometimes need to do it a different way. This as much as I'd like for our brains to be a programming language, because that would be easier to understand, they're not. And so you're just going to kind of have to deal with exceptions. You can't make a set of rules that gets everything all the time. It won't work that way. In one of the earlier podcast episodes, I quoted, or I gave the sentiment that Gandhi said, right? I said, be the change you want to see in the world. I do want to kind of circle back to that. That was a person named Arlene Lawrence. It was not Gandhi. Again, Gandhi said something very much like, be the change you want to see in the world, but it was like 2 paragraphs long. The person who said, be the change you want to see in the world was named Arlene Lawrence. Just, not Gandhi. So earlier when I talked about that, it was a joke about beer. What I had said was I often use inspirational quotes to do things in real life. And so if I'm at a party and you're running low on beer, I might grab you another one or myself another one and think to myself, be the change you want to see in the world, right? And my point is that Gandhi probably didn't mean go get me beer. But mine was a joke about beer, but I really do think that as I try to do stuff. My internal dialogue is something like, is this how I'd want others to act? Is this how I want the world to be? Like if we all acted like that, what would the world turn into? And if you can't answer that in a way that you'd like, the answer is you shouldn't act that way. It's just kind of a filter or like coin shaker that you put your ideas through. If you'd want other people to act that way, the activity moves on to the next shaker, right? If we get through the golden rule, there's a tray right under it. Mine just kind of creatively ends in beer sometimes. To continue the hotel analogy from earlier, there are going to be special guests, like really hard thoughts or really big circumstances, right? That perhaps the manager would like to handle directly, right? Like some big scary thing or traumatic life event is happening. You maybe don't need to just shake that through your filters. You know that's a big deal, right? Think of it like a complaining guest or like a VIP, right? You're the manager of your brain. Think of the entries in our framework as kind of like the levers you could pull to make an unhappy guest reevaluate their outlook on their stay in your hotel. I was going to say something like make them more comfortable or get them free room service. But if you have a thought in your head that you don't want, you probably shouldn't try to make it more comfortable. You get to pick your worldview. And so it's your brain. If it shouldn't be there, kick it out. And so the very last kind of bullet point I want to talk about is that this is really easy to say, but that it is very hard to do. And there are some really specific reasons for why this is hard to do. And then that's kind of my 4th bullet point. I'm going to have a lot more episodes around why your brain will mess this whole process up for you if you let it. And I'll give some examples just so you sort of know what I'm talking about. But in good eats fashion, this is absolutely one of those, that's another episode, probably several more episodes. But every cognitive bias or fallacy that you've ever heard of is working against you making these good choices. I'm also of the opinion, and it's not necessarily just my opinion, I'll cite some sources, that there are leftover parts of the way that your brain processes information that were probably useful when you lived in a cave, however long ago that was. But in modern internet society where I'm talking to you on a podcast that you can listen to wherever you want, those sorts of thought processes just aren't to your benefit anymore. But if your brain is still operating the way it's always operated and you don't purposefully try to change it, you're probably actually acting against your own best interests, and maybe you don't realize it yet. And one example I'll give of that is just math. I love math, but I understand not everybody does. And so in the same way that I've taken time to sort of make sure we all have the same vocabulary about philosophical concepts. We talked about epistemology, right? I'll take the time to make sure we have the same vocabulary about those math concepts before we have those conversations. But I absolutely would like to spend time going through and talking about why, despite your best intentions or attempts or trying to do the right thing, it maybe just doesn't work that way. And that's fine, because there's a lot of reasons that you may not realize are working against you that you have to overcome just to make good choices. So hopefully after this episode, you get the sort of maxims I'm looking for. Again, the golden rule's just the first level of the coin shaker. There's a bunch more levels. Again, I'm going to call that a framework just because that's easier for me to keep track of. If you have a different term for that, please let me know. As a request, I do kind of need your help as a listening audience. I keep just calling you because in my mind I'm speaking to one person. That's how the podcast works, right? Somebody clicks play on Spotify or Anchor, and then you're listening to me talk to you. That's how it works, right? But there's more than one of you. I need a name for a collective you. At this point, I think I probably want to call you memers. If you don't have a better choice than that, you're probably going to wind up as memers. I'm not leaning into that all the way yet. So if you think that's a dumb name or you have a better one, this is kind of the plug for engagement. If you think any of the stuff that I'm talking about here, or have talked about in any other podcast is interesting, I write about that sort of stuff on Reddit and Twitter, and so you can follow me on Reddit or Twitter. That information should be available in my Anchor profile. But there's a subreddit set up on Reddit to talk about this sort of stuff. And I do understand that not everybody in the audience maybe has Reddit set up. And so for the rest of the podcast, I'm just going to spend a second talking about how you would set Reddit up. If you already know that, feel free to leave. If you don't know that, this section's for you. So everybody, thank you very much for staying. But anybody who's interested in engaging, but maybe doesn't know how, I'm going to stop here, but then make a primer after this for you. So Reddit is just a site on the internet, like anything else, like Google News or Facebook, right? But what Reddit is a collection of information and thoughts and ideas and questions that other people post. And other people, besides the ones who posted it, then just kind of engage with that content. And so subreddits, like memes, exist kind of for everything. If you want to talk about giraffes, there's a subreddit for giraffes. If you just want recipes, there's a subreddit for recipes. If you just really like ducks, right, there's a subreddit for ducks. The point is Reddit kind of has a place for everything. And so I would like to have a conversation about the stuff in this podcast, right? These concepts as they relate, self-help using memes, right? That's the point. And so to house this conversation, Reddit as a platform or a website already has the tools we'd want to have that conversation. And so instead of making a Facebook group or something like that, I know Reddit. And so I think a subreddit is the best way to do that. And so if you've heard me say that a bunch, be like, what's a subreddit? How do I do that? Reddit's really easy. So you can download Reddit on your phone. It's either in the App Store or in the Play Store, depending on your platform. It's a website. So if you're on an actual computer, just type reddit.com. You make a profile for free like you'd make anything else. It can be anonymous or to a fake email address. People do that for specific sorts of questions. It's not weird if you want to be anonymous on Reddit. That's kind of the point. But once you get there, you just decide what you want to look at. So you've made your account. You've decided the kinds of things you care about, like cat pictures or self-help using memes. And then you get to pick. You literally just sign up for whatever communities you want to see, and leave the communities you don't. And then after that, you have a curated kind of front page view of everything that you care about. And so I would hope that this content is something that you care about. And so if you hear me say something that you think is cool, or you have a hot take on, or you want to answer a question, or you think I got wrong, that's also really important. Please come and engage. To anyone that's still listening and already knows how Reddit works, thanks. The other thing that I'll say is I've already put 5 or 6 different like starter topics or questions just on the subreddit to get it started. Right now it's me talking to myself. So if anybody else wants to go in there and answer the questions I've asked or give takes on the thoughts I have there, maybe if that engagement doesn't happen, I turn those into podcast episodes. But for now, just go to the Reddit and see what I'm talking about there. But anyway, this outro was much longer than I meant for it to be, but I really do want this to turn into a discussion or a community building activity. So I really appreciate everybody's time and listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Thanks a bunch. This has been a podcast about self-help using memes. Thanks for listening.